Hello everyone. This recording is for the Equity Keynote, which will be facilitated by Bianca Bodridge at 1:15 p.m. Central on October 20th, 2020. During this presentation, Bianca will speak to the present uprisings against racist violence, a global health pandemic, and economic injustice, and offer us a moment to reflect on the power and importance of youth development programs. This session focuses on the importance of critical reflection as leaders, the urgency of a social justice approach to youth development, and why fostering dream spaces for youth is imperative at this moment. We would ask that you take a moment to answer the reflection questions asked during this recording. Also, write down any questions that you would like to ask Bianca during the live session on October 20th. Bianca J. Bodridge is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She earned her PhD in sociology and education from Columbia University Teachers College. Her scholarship explores the socio-political context of community-based youth work and after-school education. Bianca's research critically examines the confluence of race, class, and gender, and its impact on educational reforms that shape community-based spaces that engage Black and Latinx youth. She explores the organizational and pedagogical practices employed by youth workers and community-based educators amid neoliberal education restructuring. Her book, with Stanford University Press, Reclaiming Community, Race and the Uncertain Future of Youth Work, examines how the privatization of public education undermines Black community-based organizations' efforts to support comprehensive youth development opportunities.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bianca J. Baldridge. I'm an associate professor of educational policy studies. Before I became a professor, I was actually a youth worker in many youth development organizations in Los Angeles, which is my hometown, Oakland, Washington, D.C., and New York City. My research is deeply informed by my experiences as a youth worker. I understand the significance of your work, and so I'd like to thank you for the work that you do. And I wanted to thank you for taking a moment to listen to this presentation. Although many people think that after-school education or youth work, people think about it as free from some of the constraints that schools deal with, my research and experiences as a youth worker show that this isn't the case. As a sociologist of education, my work has led me to study the socio-political context of community-based youth work and after-school education and the complexity of these spaces, from their connection to the state and larger systems of oppression to their connections to schools and trends within educational policy. These spaces can exist as paradoxical spaces. We know that this work is sacred. Youth development spaces are indeed sacred. But research has shown, right, that young people would much rather spend time in youth organizations than schools. At the same time, we also must understand that they can be sites that both disrupt and reproduce harm. Because this work is near and dear to my heart, whenever I have the privilege of engaging community-based leaders or youth workers, I always want to begin with a point of critical reflection. And so this quote is from one of my favorite writers, K.S.A. Lehman, who wrote the book Heavy. He writes about his educational experiences in schools and specifically about his teachers not doing their homework. He writes, "There are so many things we needed in those classrooms, in our city, in our state, in our country, that our teachers could have provided if they would have gone home and really done their homework. They never once said the words economic inequality, housing discrimination, sexual violence, mass incarceration, homophobia, empire, mass eviction, post-traumatic stress disorder, white supremacy, patriarchy, neo-Confederacy, mental health, or parental abuse. Yet every student and teacher at that school lived in a world shaped by those words." Although KSA in that moment is talking about school-based teachers, this holds true for anyone engaging with young people. As professionals in your line of work, you know that you see young people and can recognize the symptoms of these larger structural issues and systems of oppression that KSA named. Building on this quote, I want to draw your attention to 3 reflection questions that I often use in my work with community-based leaders and youth workers. The first question is, who are you? Second question is, why do you engage in this work? The third question is, why should it be you? And a fourth question to add is to think about our current moment. And the question is, what is our current what in our current political reality is demanding of you right now as a leader? What is this current moment demanding of you right now as a leader? Throughout the rest of our short time together in this presentation, I want to just name a few ideas for you to sit with, reflect on, and I look forward to discussing these ideas with you all in a few weeks. So the first thing I want to mention is this idea of historical community memory. So rooted in my discussion of youth work throughout my research, specifically engaging Black youth, is that the fact that community-led education and affirmation and learning or youth development, programming, youth work is not a new thing. The terms we use to describe youth work or after-school care has always occurred and has had to because of systemic whiteness, anti-Blackness, poverty, displacement. But the work, the guidance, the care, the education of young people outside of school context is not a new thing. From the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program to faith-based spaces, vulnerable and oppressed communities have always found ways, often against violence, to guide young people through oppressive systems and through various stages of development. I'm pointing this out because it's important to know that our work fits within a broader historical legacy. I think it also reminds us that communities hold agency and power and know exactly what it is young people need. As we all know, we are currently living in a difficult reality right now. I'm reminded often of the activist Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, who reminds us not to think about our current reality as a moment. Rather, she encourages us to think about this current reality as a movement, right? Or what I like to say, another iteration of a movement towards justice. Now, this is hard for me because I often think about things, in the moment that we're in, but thinking about sort of the historical legacy that I mentioned before and the fact that has always been a struggle for racial justice cannot be lost, right? We have to sort of be mindful of the fact that a lot of what we're experiencing feels heightened and is definitely exacerbated, but it isn't new. So while there are unique challenges that many young people are facing because of COVID-19, this health pandemic has exacerbated challenges and has increased race and class inequities that have always existed. One of my worries at this time is the pressure to make youth development programs look more like schools by narrowing the range of their work. This is something that I express and share in my recent book, and it stems from a number of issues, including trends within educational policy as well as philanthropy, among other things. Right now, during this global health pandemic, the public discourse in education is primarily about learning loss. But as you all know, given the work that you do and the ways that you connect with young people to the outdoors and self-discovery, academic gains are not the most important things, especially at this moment. We are currently living through multiple pandemics. Fostering understanding of the current moment and what led us here, social emotional care and healing should be primary. As I mentioned earlier, what we are currently facing as a nation is not new, even if it feels that way. And let me be clear, anti-Black racism is endemic to this nation. Assault on the indigenous communities and their land is not new. Family separation at our nation's border and the grotesque xenophobic physical and psychic violence being enacted on children and their families is unfortunately not new. State violence with impunity is not new. Economic injustice and job precarity and a climate crisis on top of a global health pandemic that is disproportionately impacting Indigenous, Latinx, and Black communities feels like too much to bear. Despite this reality, I'm comforted by the brilliance of young people, and I try to think about the opportunities that are emerging within the out-of-school time sector at this moment. As difficult as it might be to think about the good that can come from this moment, it does shine a light on the strengths of youth development programs and fostering deep connections to the outdoors, strong relationships rooted in care, radical healing, and a focus on cultural, social, and political development and resistance. This moment offers us an opportunity to appreciate youth work and provide the support and investment that it requires to lift up the aspects of youth work that contribute to a more just society. Coping and working under the stress of a global pandemic indeed produces challenges in how we exist within physical space and how we mobilize for change. There are three things that I'd like to leave you all with, right? And opportunities that I feel are present in this moment. The first is that I'm noticing that there is a strengthening and renewing of positive youth adult partnerships in much more meaningful ways. We are all living in the same world, seeing the same things, and because of our own social positioning in society, um, we experience the world differently because of our various social identities. This is a key moment to listen to young people as partners in their growth, as growth in their own learning and self-discovery. In order to do this, we have to reframe our thinking about what young people are capable of and see them as collaborators in their learning. The second thing where I think there is an opportunity is that there is renewed activism and intergenerational organizing. I've been inspired by all that youth work programs have been doing in the last 6 months or so. At the beginning of the pandemic, I know program leaders and youth workers and activists who were finding ways to continue virtually doing programming. So you had program leaders who were planning virtual graduations while also standing alongside young people as they took to the streets to demand racial justice against state violence. Intergenerational organizing and relationship building is essential. The youth development space is a prime opportunity where this occurs and should be fostered, especially in our current reality. The third opportunity that I see are the meaningful relationships, partnerships, and collaborations between school districts, cities, and youth development programs. I've written about how the broader educational community should value and appreciate youth development organizations and the essential work that they provide to youth, families, and communities more broadly. I've been humbled by youth programs, school districts, and local city governments that have fostered reciprocal and meaningful partnerships and collaboration because they understand that a young person is connected to all those spaces. I've been moved by partnerships where school-based educators understand and value what youth workers and youth program leaders bring to educational, social, cultural, and the political lives of young people. What I appreciate is how youth programs are coming in connection and partnership with school districts and cities, and recognizing that supporting a young person should be at the center and not competition. Also, in thinking about, in addition to COVID-19, we are in the middle of uprisings and rebellions against anti-Black violence and police brutality. And I think this offers us a critical reminder that the broader sociopolitical context of youth development is always present and demands our attention, our study, and our understanding. Having a real understanding of the nuances and complexities of racism, patriarchy, economic injustice will shift our understanding of why we do this work. I believe that this demands that we reframe our work and abandon the idea that we are fixing people, but rather we are recognizing that we are aware of systemic inequalities that shape the lives of the young people we engage and shapes how we move through the world, right? As leaders, as program leaders, as youth workers. This is important because how we think about young people is essential for how we are designing programs for them, how we engage them, and how we treat them within our youth development spaces. In doing this, we are forced to remove the savior narratives, which breeds paternalism and deficit language that is far too rampant in youth work. In order to reframe the way, frame the way that youth work is often discussed, I think it requires us to remove our focus on fixing youth who we deem broken, right? And recognize that our work is about providing opportunities for youth to nurture skills, discover talents, and become who they are so that they can be the best version of themselves. In order to do this, we must be cognizant of the systems of inequalities that shapes our lives and young people's. To this end, I have another set of questions that I'd like us to sit with. So the first question is, what is it that we believe about ourselves when we use deficit language and hold ideas about the young people that we work with? What does it signal to young people, their families, and their communities when we use that type of language, right? When we think about young people as needing to be fixed, needing to be saved. And how do we disrupt this thinking, right? Not just in our hearts and minds, but how do we disrupt it in our practice? And how do we disrupt it in the culture of our programs? One of the things that I've learned from engaging with so many youth workers around the country, program leaders around the country, is that there are moments where they claim to do certain things, where they claim to treat and engage young people in a particular way. There's certain values and philosophies that the organization might stand by, but what actually happens in practice? Right? So, how do certain ideas get embedded, right, in the culture of our organizations, and how do we disrupt that? So these questions lead me to discuss with a bit more detail the significance of a social justice approach to youth development. So the social justice approach to youth development was created, and lots of research has been done on this through two scholars and activists and youth workers who I respect in the field, Sean Wright and Julio Camarota, who talked about the ways that positive youth development frameworks often leave out young people of color, young people who are disenfranchised by poverty. And I think this can be extended to other young people who are experiencing compounding layers of oppression. And so, in looking at the model, there are four areas that I want to highlight. The first is how important it is to be explicit with young people in youth development organizations about the social problems that they see and live and experience. Right? So, being explicit about social and political problems. So, in other words, helping young people identify social and political problems in their schools, in their communities, and in the world at large, so that they can understand how sort of those systems and structures impact their day-to-day lives. Connected to that is the second idea of critical social capital. And this is the connection, right? Going back to the connection between youth and adults, where there's an intergenerational connection between young people and adults, where young people and adults are working together to identify social and political problems within their schools and communities, to then begin to figure out ways and strategies and tools to enact change. So one of what's important about this is helping young people identify these issues as systemic and political issues, and not as a fault of their own doing or as a fault of their families or culture or communities. What's important about this is it's putting the focus right back on systemic inequalities, structural inequalities, and not within individuals. The third point is related to critical consciousness, right? How do we sort of offer space for young people to share their critique of the world? In my work with middle school students and high school students, one of the things that I learned real quickly, right, is that young people have a critique of the world. Right? They see issues, right? They look at the news, right? They are engaging in their schools. They see and can identify particular problems, right? They may not have the language that we use all the time as adults, but they understand it. So in our programs, how do we um, uh, create opportunities for young people to become critically and socially aware of their surroundings? How do we understand and help them sort of read the world as they know it and to begin to act upon it for social change? And the last point is thinking about young people as assets and agents. So there's a lot of research about the ways that young people are resilient, and we know that they are. But how do we move beyond that and also think about them as agents of change, right? Looking at them for what they bring to the table, right? Again, not about fixing them, not about looking at them as broken, but looking at them for what the talents and the skills that they offer to the spaces that we create, right? So how are young people considered and woven into our programs as assets as well as agents of change? One of the last pieces that I want to share with you is, in our current political reality, I am often saddened, and sometimes I don't feel very hopeful about the state of the world. And that's difficult. That's a difficult position to sometimes be in, considering that I work with young people and work with youth workers and program leaders who are, engaging and trying to inspire young people. And so I want to talk for a moment about fostering dream spaces for young people. And in July, I had the opportunity to organize a webinar for the Spencer Foundation. And during this webinar, I was able to pull my networks and gather youth workers, program directors, and leaders around the country, researchers, and activists to talk about the power of youth work and how important it is as we wrestle with multiple pandemics, right? So not just COVID, and but also, right, systemic state violence, racial injustice, economic injustice, right? And a program leader from Milwaukee raised the question towards the end of the webinar about how we can cultivate and foster dream spaces for young people amid all that is happening in the world. And this question really stuck with me. And I see it as being tied to the social justice approach of youth development, where we must simultaneously be aware of and challenge oppressive structures while also holding on to hope that allows us to fight for change and to dream and to thrive alongside young people. And connected to that, right, is I think we spend a lot of time telling young people what they should do, how they should think, what they should feel. And last week, I had an opportunity to do yet another webinar and organize a panel for colleagues of mine who have recently edited a book about the importance of youth-adult partnerships in out-of-school time. And two of the panelists were student authors, student contributors to the book. And I wanted to ask them, right, what they believed young people needed at this particular moment. And the first student was a college student. And her reply was that she needed rest, she needed reprieve. She directly said, "We are tired." Another high school another student who was in high school in Los Angeles employed the audience to remember that young people are human too. He said this after sharing that his school is requiring the same amount of work with less time for instruction. And so while I believe that young people are resilient, I also believe that we cannot forget their humanity and again be mindful that they too are living through this moment just like us. They need time and space to process. They also need spaces to cultivate joy and creativity and engage in social emotional learning now more than ever. And youth development organizations are really such a wonderful opportunity to create joy, right, and creativity and engage in social emotional learning. And with that, I'd like to end by more reflecting questions. I think these questions are important just for us to even sit with. So whether you write answers to these questions down, whether you sort of ponder them as you go about the rest of your day, I'd like to leave you with these things. So the first question is, as a leader, what is it that you think you need to rethink and then change? The second question is, in what ways can you foreground and embody social justice in your work? And that involves personal work, right? That involves the homework that Kiese Lehman wrote about in his book, Heavy. Right? That requires sometimes a reframing of our language and how we talk about young people and the communities that we engage in and how that's embedded in our culture. And the third question is, how are you listening to the needs and concerns of youth, the educators who you work with, and the families that you engage? So I'll end by saying that youth development programs are indeed sacred work. And I strongly believe that this is a moment where the work of youth development organizations can really shine. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to engaging you within a few weeks. Thank you.